The rejection ceremony was supposed to break her. That was its purpose. Humiliation was a tool, a whetstone to sharpen the pack's hierarchy, and she was the stone being ground to dust. Ilara stood on the ceremonial platform, the rough-hewn wood cold against the thin soles of her slippers. Below, the entire Blackwood pack watched, their faces a mixture of pity, scorn, and hungry anticipation. They craved this drama. It affirmed their own places in the rigid order of their lives. Across from her stood Daxon, the pack's beta. His jaw was set, his shoulders broad and imposing in his formal leathers. He was handsome, powerful, and today he was her fated mate. For about 10 more seconds, the moon goddess, they were told, made no mistakes. She wove the threads of destiny, pairing souls that were meant to burn together. Ilara had always wondered if the goddess ever had a bad day, if she ever dropped a stitch. "I, Daxon, beta of the Blackwood pack," he began, his voice booming across the silent clearing, "find myself bound by fate to the Omega, Ilara." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The Omega, Ilara. Not just Ilara. Her rank was her identity, a cage she was born into. Orphan, Omega, worthless. She kept her eyes fixed on the knot of wood in the floorboards just past his feet. She had practiced this. She would not cry. She would not beg. They expected hysterics, pleading. It was the Omega way, to cling, to show weakness, to prove you were nothing without the strength of another. "This bond," Daxon continued, his voice laced with a performative regret she knew was false, "is not one I can accept. It does not serve the pack. It does not serve my station." He was rejecting her for a daughter of the Silvercrest Alpha, a political alliance that would elevate him. Ilara was not an alliance. She was an anchor. She lifted her chin, her gaze finally meeting his. She saw the flicker of surprise in his eyes. He expected tears. He saw only a calm, deep pool of resignation. She would not give him the satisfaction of her pain. "And so," he declared, raising his hands, "I, Daxon, sever this bond. I reject you, Ilara, as my mate." The words struck the air like a physical blow. A collective gasp went through the pack. This was the moment. The breaking point. Now she was supposed to fall to her knees. Ilara stood her ground. She took a slow, deliberate breath, the cold mountain air filling her lungs. She held the silence for a heartbeat, too, letting the weight of his declaration settle. Then she spoke, her voice not loud, but clear and steady, carrying in the stillness. "I, Ilara of the Blackwood pack, accept your rejection." Silence. Absolute, stunned silence. No one accepted a rejection, not like this, not with dignity. It was a fight, a desperate, soul-shredding battle to hold on to the one person the universe had chosen for you. Her quiet acceptance was a defiance more shocking than any scream. Daxon stared, his script forgotten. The crowd was frozen. They didn't know how to react. And then a new voice cut through the tension. It was low, cold, and coated in absolute authority. It was a voice that could freeze rivers and command armies. "Stop!" Every head turned. On a raised dais, seated on a throne of black iron and obsidian, sat the visiting monarch, King Kalen, the Alpha of all Alphas, the Shadow King of the Northern Realms. He had been a silent, intimidating observer until now. He rose from his throne. He was a terrifying figure, tall and clad in black furs and silver armor that seemed to drink the light. His face was all sharp angles and unforgiving planes, his eyes the color of a winter storm. A faint, almost invisible shimmer of frost seemed to cling to him, a rumor of the curse that haunted his bloodline. He descended the steps of the dais, each footfall a death knell to the ceremony's order. The pack members parted before him like water before a shark. He walked until he stood before the platform, his gaze locked on Ilara. It was like being seen for the first time in her life, truly seen, and it was terrifying. "She is no longer yours to reject," the king said, his voice a low growl that vibrated in Ilara's bones. He did not look at Daxon. His focus was entirely, unnervingly, on her. Daxon sputtered, his face paling. "Your Majesty, the ritual is—" "The ritual is over," Kaelin interrupted, the words sharp as broken glass. He finally turned his head, a slight, dismissive movement, to pin Daxon with a look of pure contempt. "You discarded her. Your claim is forfeit." He then raised a hand, pointing a single, leather-clad finger at Ilara. The gesture was possessive, absolute. "She is mine now." The world tilted on its axis. The pack stared, mouths agape. Daxon looked as if he had been struck by lightning. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. The Shadow King, the broken, cursed ruler feared by all, had just claimed her. An Omega, an orphan, nothing. Kaelin's guards, huge men in dark steel, moved with silent efficiency. Two of them were on the platform in an instant, their presence overwhelming. They did not touch her, but stood on either side, a clear and unmistakable barrier. "My king," the Blackwood Alpha stammered, rushing forward. "There must be some mistake. She is an Omega. She has no standing, no power." "I am the king," Kaelin stated, as if that explained everything. And perhaps it did. "Her standing is what I say it is. Her power is my concern." His gaze flickered back to Ilara, cold and assessing. "She has a spine. That is more than I can say for most of my court. I have a use for that." A use? She was not a person, but a tool, a curiosity, a strange, defiant bauble he had decided to pick up. The thought should have been insulting. Instead, a strange, desperate spark of hope ignited in her chest. Anything was better than the slow death of being an outcast in her own pack. "Pack your things," one of the guards said, his voice a low rumble. "You have nothing? Even better. We leave at once." Ilara was escorted from the platform, walking through the sea of her former packmates. Their faces were no longer scornful, but filled with a new expression, awe and fear. She was no longer Ilara the Omega. She was the king's possession. She didn't look back at Daxon. She didn't need to. The image of his shocked, enraged face was burned into her memory. He had thrown her away, and a king had picked her up. She had no idea if she had been saved or merely transferred to a more gilded cage. The journey to the Obsidian Keep was a blur of speed and silence. She rode in an enclosed carriage, the king's personal guard surrounding it. She did not see Kaelin again until they arrived. The keep was not a castle. It was a fortress. It clawed its way up the side of the highest mountain in the realm, a jagged spear of black rock and shimmering ice. It looked hostile, unconquerable. It looked like its master. Ilara was led through massive gates and into a courtyard that felt colder than the wind outside. Servants rushed out, their heads bowed. They scurried around with an air of profound fear. This was a place where no one smiled. She was taken to a suite of rooms that were larger than the entire hovel she had grown up in. A fire roared in a vast stone hearth, yet it did little to chase the bone-deep chill from the air. The furniture was dark wood, the tapestries rich, but depicting grim battles and lonely landscapes. It was luxurious, but it was a prison. A young servant girl with wide, nervous eyes helped her settle in. Her name was Bryn. She was the first person to show Ilara a shred of simple kindness since the ceremony. "The king! He has never done this before," Bryn whispered, her hands trembling as she laid out a woolen gown for Ilara. Brought someone here? A woman? Why did he? Ilara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Bryn shook her head frantically. No one asks the king why, we just obey. Later that night he summoned her. Not to his chambers, but to the throne room. It was an cavernous hall, the walls sheer obsidian, that reflected the torchlight like 1,000 captured stars. At the far end, on his throne of ice and iron, sat Kaelin. He looked even more intimidating here, in the heart of his power. The legendary frost seemed to cling to him more thickly, a visible aura of cold that made the air around him shimmer. Come closer, he commanded. Ilara walked the long expanse of polished black floor, her soft slippers making no sound. She stopped a respectful distance away, her hands clasped before her. You are wondering why you are here, he said. It was not a question. Yes, your majesty. My court is a pit of vipers, he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Everyone is jockeying for position, for influence. They try to chain me with alliances, with marriage pacts. They present me with their daughters, their sisters, all of them suitable, all of them hungry. He leaned forward, his storm-grey eyes boring into her. You are not suitable. You are not hungry for power. You are nothing, an omega, an outcast, and you are therefore perfect. The words were a slap, but she understood the cold logic. She was a disruption, a piece on the board that no one could have predicted. I will name you my consort, he continued. It will throw them all into chaos. They will be so busy trying to understand you, to undermine you, that they will leave me alone. In return for this service, you will have a life of safety and luxury far beyond what you could have ever known. It was a transaction, a cold, political calculation. Her defiance at the ceremony had not been a sign of inner strength to him, but a useful trait in a pawn. The small spark of hope in her chest flickered and died. "And what do you require of me?" she asked, her voice steady. A flicker of something, surprise, respect, crossed his face for a fraction of a second. You will attend functions by my side. You will be silent. You will be observant. You will do nothing but exist. Is that clear? Yes, Your Majesty. Good. You are dismissed. She turned and walked away, the weight of his gaze on her back. She had escaped one prison only to enter another. This one had silk sheets and warm fires, but its bars were made of a king's cold, calculated whim. The days that followed were a lesson in isolation. Ilara was a ghost in the Obsidian Keep. The court members, led by a haughty, beautiful woman named Lady Seraphina, and the king's own uncle, a man named Regent Valerius, treated her with icy disdain. They looked through her, their whispers following her like wasps. Lady Seraphina was the woman Daxon would have killed for, and the one Valerius was pushing as a match for the king. Her hatred for Ilara was palpable. Valerius, on the other hand, was smooth and cloying. He treated her with a false kindness that felt more dangerous than open hostility. Kaelin was true to his word. He was a distant, cold presence. He paraded her at his side during formal dinners and council meetings, his hand resting formally on the small of her back, a touch that felt as cold as stone even through the fabric of her gown. He never spoke to her beyond curt commands. Her only comfort was Bryn, the servant girl, who would sneak her extra blankets and share gossip from the castle staff. It was from Bryn that Ilara learned more about the king's curse. They call it the Frost Heart, Bryn whispered one evening while mending one of Ilara's dresses. An old curse from the Unseelie Wars. It's settled in the royal bloodline. It grows colder with each generation. They say his heart is slowly turning to ice, that one day
he'll just freeze. The thought sent a shiver down Ilara's spine that had nothing to do with the castle's chill. She thought of his cold touch, the perpetual winter in his eyes. He was not just emotionally distant. He was dying, a slow, cold death. One night, a scream tore through the silence of the castle. Not a scream of fear, but of pure, unadulterated agony. Ilara shot out of bed, her heart pounding. The sound had come from the direction of the king's chambers. Driven by an instinct she didn't understand, she ran. The guards outside his door, men who would normally cut her down for such a transgression, were pale and distressed. They made no move to stop her as she pushed past them and threw open the heavy oak doors. The room was freezing. Frost coated the windows, the furniture, the very air.
In the center of the room, Kalen was on his knees, his body racked with tremors. His shirt was open and she could see it, a lattice of shimmering blue ice spreading across his chest from his heart, glowing faintly in the moonlight. He was gasping, his face contorted in a mask of unbearable pain. "Get out!" he snarled, his voice tight with agony. Ilara ignored him. She saw not the fearsome king, but a man in torment. She remembered the whispers of the curse. This was it. This was the frost taking hold. Without thinking, she knelt in front of him. "Let me help you." "No one can help," he ground out, his teeth clenched. "The cold. It is unbearable." She remembered her own secret. The little spark of warmth she could summon, the forbidden light she had hidden her entire life. They said her kind of magic, fire magic, was an abomination. They said it had been wiped out centuries ago, but it was all she had. Hesitantly, she reached out her hand. She focused, drawing on that small, secret wellspring of power inside her. A soft golden light bloomed in her palm, warm and gentle. Kalen's head snapped up. His pain-filled eyes widened as he stared at her glowing hand. "What is that?" "I don't know," she whispered honestly. "It's just me." Ignoring every instinct for self-preservation, she pressed her warm, glowing palm against the center of his chest, directly over the spreading ice. The contact was a shock to them both. For him, it was not the searing agony he expected from any touch. It was warmth, a deep, penetrating warmth that felt like the first sun after a decade of winter. He gasped, a sound of pure relief. The tremors racking his body lessened. For Ilara, it was like touching a block of solid ice. The cold of him seeped into her, shocking and painful, but her inner fire flared in response, pushing back against it. She watched, mesmerized, as the glowing blue frost on his skin seemed to shrink away from her touch, receding by a fraction of an inch. She held her hand there, pouring her warmth into him. The light from her palm pulsed, a steady golden beat against his skin. The ice retreated further. The rigid lines of pain on his face softened. His breathing evened out. Finally, the tremors stopped completely. He slumped forward, his forehead resting against her shoulder, his entire weight leaning on her. He was still impossibly cold, but the aggressive, killing frost had retreated. They stayed like that for a long time, kneeling on the frozen floor. He, the broken king, finding his first moment of peace in years. She, the outcast Omega, holding the key to his survival in the palm of her hand. "How?" he finally rasped, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "I've always been able to do it," she confessed, her voice shaking slightly. "A little light, a little warmth. I was taught to hide it. They said it was a curse." He lifted his head, his grey eyes searching hers. The storm in them had calmed, replaced by a raw, bewildered vulnerability she had never seen before. "They were wrong," he said, his voice thick with a strange new emotion. "It's not a curse, it's a miracle." That night changed everything. The transaction was over. She was no longer a pawn. She was his lifeline. Kalen did not speak of it the next day, not directly, but the shift was undeniable. His guards were instructed to treat her not as a consort, but with the reverence due a queen. The quality of her food, her clothes, the deference of the staff, it all elevated overnight. He began to seek her out, not in the cold formality of the court, but in the quiet moments between. He would find her in the library, a vast, dusty room she had claimed as her sanctuary, and simply sit in a chair across from her, not speaking, just being in her presence. The oppressive chill that always surrounded him seemed less potent when she was near. One evening he found her staring out a window at the falling snow. "It never stops here," she murmured, watching the flakes drift down. "It feels that way," he agreed, coming to stand beside her. He was closer than he had ever stood before. She could feel the faint cold radiating from him, but it was no longer frightening. "The curse," he said, his voice low. "It began when I was a boy, a gift from a visiting dignitary, a beautiful sculpted shard of crystal. My uncle Valerius told me to keep it close. It was a sign of friendship between our kingdoms." Ilara turned to look at him. His face was a mask in the dim light, but his voice was heavy with memory. "It wasn't a gift. It was a vessel for the frost heart. Every day, a little more of its chill seeped into me. By the time the healers realized what it was too late. It had bonded to my own magic, to my soul. They said it would consume me by my 30th year. How long?" she whispered. "My 30th birthday is in 3 months." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and cold as a tombstone. He was living on borrowed time. "Your warmth," he said, struggling with the word, with the feeling. "It is the only thing that has ever pushed it back. Before you, all I could do was endure." An act of kindness, she realized. This confession, he was sharing his deepest vulnerability, the secret that isolated him from the world. He was trusting her. A few nights later, the pain returned, not as violently as before, but a deep, aching cold that made him restless. He came to her room, a silent spectre in the doorway. He didn't have to speak. She saw the agony in the tight line of his jaw. She took his hand. It was like gripping a marble statue. She led him to the settee by her fire and sat, keeping his hand clasped in both of hers. She summoned her light, letting it flow from her palms into his skin. They sat in silence for hours. He watched her, his expression unreadable. She felt his hand slowly, almost imperceptibly, lose some of its deathly chill. The tension in his shoulders eased. Eventually his exhaustion overcame his pain. His head nodded and his eyes drifted shut. He slumped sideways, his head coming to rest in her lap. Ilara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. The mighty Shadow King was asleep, vulnerable, his head pillowed on her thighs. She didn't dare move. She kept the warm light flowing into his hand, which was still clutched in hers. She watched the firelight play over the sharp angles of his face, softening them. In sleep, he looked younger, less like a terrifying monarch, and more like a man burdened by a terrible weight. A tendril of his dark hair fell across his forehead. Without thinking, she reached with her free hand and gently brushed it back. Her fingers grazed his temple. His skin was still cold, but it was the cold of winter, not the cold of the grave. He stirred at her touch, a low murmur escaping his lips. But he didn't wake. He settled more deeply, a sigh of contentment whispering past his lips. It was the most peaceful sound she had ever heard in this fortress of ice and silence. She eventually drifted off herself, lulled by the crackling fire and the steady weight of him. She woke to the grey light of dawn, stiff and sore, but with the king still sleeping soundly in her lap. His face was turned towards her, his expression serene. As she watched, his eyes slowly opened. Grey and clear, the storm in them gone. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw not a king, not a curse, but just Kaelin. He didn't move for a long moment. He just looked at her, a profound and dawning wonder on his face. Then he slowly pushed himself up. "I have not slept like that in 15 years, he said, his voice raspy with sleep. "The pain is gone?" she asked softly. "It is quiet," he said, looking at his own hand as if it were a foreign object. "Subdued." He turned his gaze back to her. He reached out, his fingers hesitating for a moment before they gently cupped her cheek. His touch was still cool, but there was a spark, a hint of life that hadn't been there before. "Ilara," he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. And then he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but one of desperate, profound gratitude. It was tentative, searching, the press of his cool lips against hers a revelation. To him she was life, she was warmth, she was the breaking of a 15-year winter. She felt the shock of it down to her soul, and a feeling she had never dared to imagine bloomed in her chest. She kissed him back. The moment was shattered by a sharp knock on the door. Kaelin pulled back, the mask of the king slamming back into place. Lady Seraphina stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock and fury, taking in the scene. Behind her, Regent Valerius wore an expression of grave disappointment, but his eyes held a glint of triumph. "Your Majesty," Valerius said, his voice smooth as oil. "Forgive the intrusion. We were concerned. You were not in your chambers." His eyes slid to Ilara, dripping with condemnation. "It seems we have found the source of the distraction." Valerius saw her not as a cure, but as a threat, a complication to his carefully laid plans. Her growing closeness to the king was a danger to his influence. He had to remove her. His gambit was simple and cruel. He and Seraphina began to spread rumors that the Omega was a witch, that her strange influence over the king was dark magic, a spell to ensnare him and steal his power. It was poison, dripped into the ears of an already suspicious court. Seraphina, scorned and furious, became his willing accomplice. "He is not himself," she would lament to the other nobles. "She has clouded his mind. He grows weaker, more dependent on her strange arts." The final piece of their plan was to plant evidence. One afternoon, while Ilara was in the library with Kaelin, their stolen moments of quiet now a daily ritual, Valerius had Seraphina sneak into Ilara's rooms. She placed a bundle of dried nightshade, a pouch of animal bones, and a book of forbidden shadow spells under Ilara's mattress. That evening, Valerius requested an audience with the king. He brought with him the captain of the guard and the queen mother, Thessaly, a stern, formidable woman who loved her son but feared the weakness his curse brought upon their line. "My king," Valerius began, his face a mask of sorrow. "It is with the heaviest of hearts that I must bring this to you. We have long feared the Omega's influence. Now we have proof." He presented the items Seraphina had planted. "These were found in her chambers. This is witchcraft of the darkest kind. She is not healing you, my boy. She is draining you, binding you to her will." Kaelin looked at the planted evidence, then at his uncle. His face was like stone. "You searched her room?" "For your own protection, Majesty," Valerius insisted. The Queen Mother stepped forward. "Kaelin, listen to him. This girl appeared from nowhere. Your behavior has been erratic. Perhaps she is the reason the curse has seemed so active of late. Ilara's power had been growing with her connection to Kaelin. Sometimes, when she summoned her light, images would flicker in the flames. Fleeting visions she couldn't control. As Valerius spoke, Ilara stared into the flames of the throne room hearth. She focused, her fear and desperation fueling her power. She pleaded with it, begged it to show her the truth. An image bloomed in the fire, clearer than any before. A much younger Regent Valerius, his face taut with ambition. He was in a study holding a shard of black crystal. He was speaking to a shadowy figure, a sorcerer cloaked in darkness. She heard his voice, an echo across time. The curse must be slow, it must weaken him, make him dependent on my counsel. When he finally perishes, the throne will fall to a regent who knows how to rule. The vision shifted. She saw Valerius giving the crystal shard to a young, trusting Prince Kaelin. A gift, my boy, a symbol of our strength. The truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. Valerius hadn't just failed to stop the curse, he had orchestrated it. He had been poisoning his own nephew for 15 years, playing the long game for the throne. "He's lying," Ilara said, her voice trembling, as she stepped forward. All eyes turned to her. "He gave you the cursed object," she said, her gaze locked on Kaelin. "I saw it."
"He cursed you." Valerius let out a short, pitying laugh. The witch grows desperate. She spins tales to save her own skin. My king, surely you see the madness she has wrought. Kaelin was torn. This was the man who had raised him after his father's death, his uncle, his mentor. But Ilara, she was the only warmth he had known in a lifetime of cold. His instinct screamed to trust her, but a decade of his uncle's careful manipulation held him in its grip. Kaelin began, his voice uncertain for the first time. Seeing his hesitation, Valerius knew he had to act. His plan to seize the throne upon Kaelin's death was too slow. Ilara was accelerating things. She was a cure, and he could not allow that. He had to end it now. He reached into his robes. "If you will not see reason, Kaelin, then I must act as regent to save the kingdom from a bewitched king." He pulled out a black obsidian orb, a magical amplifier.
He slammed it down onto the stone floor. "Forgive me, nephew." A wave of absolute, soul-crushing cold erupted from the orb. It was aimed directly at Kaelin. The king cried out, stumbling back as the Frostheart curse, magnified 100-fold, flared within him. The blue ice didn't just creep across his skin, it exploded across his chest, encasing his arms, crawling up his neck. He collapsed to his knees, his breath turning to thick, white vapor, his body seizing violently. "Kaelin!" his mother screamed. "Behold!" Valerius shouted to the horrified court. "The witch's final spell! She tried to kill him when her deception was revealed. Caesar!" The guards hesitated, shocked by the suddenness of it all. But Ilara did not wait. She ran, not away, but towards Kaelin. He was freezing before her eyes. The ice was reaching for his face, his skin turning a deathly blue-white. His eyes, wide with agony and shock, found hers, a silent plea. She knew a simple touch wouldn't be enough. The amplifier was too strong. She would have to give it everything, all of her fire, all of her life force. It would probably kill her. She didn't hesitate. She threw her arms around him, pressing her body against his frozen form. "I am here," she whispered against his icy skin. She closed her eyes and reached deep inside herself, past the small, gentle spark she had always known. She reached for the core of it, the furnace she had never dared to touch. She let go of every fear, every reservation, and unleashed it all. A blinding wave of golden white light erupted from her. It was not a gentle warmth, it was a supernova. The throne room was washed in the light of a miniature sun. The heat was immense, a physical force that blasted outwards. The obsidian amplifier on the floor cracked, then shattered into 1,000 pieces. Lady Seraphina screamed and shielded her eyes. Valerius staggered back, a look of pure disbelief on his face. For Kaelin, the wave of pure life, of fire, was an agonizing, glorious deliverance. It slammed into the ancient ice of the curse, not melting it, but shattering it. He felt centuries of cold break apart inside him, the magical shackles on his soul snapping one by one. The blue ice on his skin didn't just recede, it vaporized, turning to steam that hissed off his body. For Ilara, it was like being hollowed out. She felt her life force pouring out of her, a river of light feeding a dying star. The world went white, then grey, then black. Her strength gave out, and the immense backlash of unleashing so much raw power threw her backwards. She flew across the room, limp as a doll, and slammed against the far wall before crumpling to the floor in a heap. The light vanished, silence descended. Kaelin was on his feet. He was no longer pale or trembling. Colour had returned to his face. The perpetual winter in his eyes was gone, replaced by a raging inferno. He took a breath, a true, deep breath, and felt the steady, warm beat of his own heart. For the first time he could remember, he was whole. He was free. He looked down at his hands, then at Valerius, his face a mask of cold fury. "Uncle," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm, "you have made a grave error." Valerius stared, his face ashen. "Impossible. The curse was absolute." "The curse is broken," Kaelin snarled. He took a step forward, his power rolling off him in palpable waves. It was no longer the cold, oppressive power of before, but the vibrant, commanding aura of a true Alpha King at his peak. "And the witch you condemned was my salvation, a salvation you tried to prevent." He pointed a finger at his uncle, his fury finally breaking its leash. "You cursed me, your own blood. For this chair," he gestured to the throne, "you left me to freeze for 15 years. Valerius, seeing it was all lost, drew a hidden sword. "The kingdom needs a strong ruler, not one dependent on an Omega's parlor tricks. Guards to me, your king is compromised." A few of Valerius's personal guard, men he had placed and promoted, drew their weapons. But the king's royal guard, seeing their master restored to his full, terrifying glory, did not hesitate. They formed a wall of steel around Kaelin. The fight was brutally short. Kaelin moved with a speed and strength he had not possessed in years. He disarmed Valerius in a single, contemptuous move, shattering his sword arm with a gauntleted fist. His guards made quick work of the traitors. Within a minute it was over. Valerius was on his knees, clutching his broken arm, his plot in ruins. But Kaelin was no longer looking at him. His eyes were fixed on the still form lying crumpled against the far wall.
"Ilara," he breathed, the name a shard of fear in his throat. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and fell to his knees beside her. She was pale, so pale and utterly still. A trickle of blood ran from her temple. He reached for her hand, his own hand, now so full of life and warmth, and felt nothing. A terrifying, profound cold. The life she had poured into him had been drained from her. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "No, you cannot take her from me. Not now." He gathered her limp body into his arms, cradling her head. "Ilara, wake up, please." She did not stir. Her sacrifice had saved him, but the cost had been her own life. The restored king held the body of his savior in his arms and let out a roar of pure, heartbroken anguish that shook the very foundations of the obsidian keep. Ilara was unconscious for 3 days. 3 days during which Kaelin did not leave her side. The finest healers in the kingdom were summoned, but they could do little. Her body was not wounded in a way they could mend. Her life force, her very spirit, was depleted, hovering on the edge of oblivion. Kaelin sat in a chair beside her bed, holding her cold, limp hand in his. His own warmth, so new and vital, seemed to mock him. He tried to push it into her, to repay the debt, but it didn't work that way. Her fire was unique, and only she could rekindle it. He dismissed his court, his council, everyone. The kingdom could wait. Valerius was locked in the deepest dungeon, Seraphina exiled in disgrace. The only thing that mattered was the still, silent woman in the bed. He talked to her, his voice low and raw. He told her everything, about the loneliness of his cold existence, about the shock of her defiance at the rejection ceremony, about the terror and wonder of her glowing hand against his frozen skin. "You were the first warmth I had felt since I was a child," he whispered, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "I was a fool. I called you a pawn, a tool. But you were the key, you were the sun, and I was too blind and frozen to see it." He confessed his fear of losing her, his dawning love, the terrible irony of being saved only to lose the one person who made life worth living. "Don't leave me in the light alone, Ilara. It's too bright without you. Please come back." On the morning of the 4th day, he was slumped in his chair, exhausted, his head resting on their joined hands. He felt a flicker, a tiny, minuscule twitch of her fingers. His head snapped up. Her eyelids were fluttering. "Ilara!" Her eyes slowly opened. They were hazy, unfocused at first. Then they found him. A small, weak smile touched her lips. "You're warm," she whispered, her voice a faint, scratchy thing. Tears, hot and real, welled in Kaelin's eyes for the first time in his adult life. He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. "You saved me." "I know," she breathed. "I saw you whole." "I love you," he said, the words rushing out, fierce and absolute. "I love you, Ilara. I almost lost you. I will not make that mistake again." Her smile widened slightly. "Join the club. We have matching symptoms." A month later, the obsidian keep was transformed. The perpetual chill was gone, replaced by the natural warmth of a living castle. Torches burned brighter, tapestries were replaced with vibrant colors, and for the first time in a generation, music and laughter could be heard in the halls. A grand ceremony was held in the throne room, but it was not for a mating or a political alliance. The entire court was assembled, along with dignitaries from every allied kingdom and alphas from every major pack. Daxon was there, standing at the back, his head bowed, a witness to the future he had so arrogantly thrown away. Kaelin stood before the throne, not in black armor, but in robes of deep royal blue and silver. He was no longer the Shadow King, but a ruler reborn. At his side stood Ilara. She wore a gown of shimmering gold, the color of her own inner fire. Her strength had returned slowly, but her spirit was brighter than ever. "Today we do not forge an alliance," Kaelin announced, his voice ringing with power and joy. "We celebrate a miracle." He turned to Ilara. In his hands he held not a simple consort circlet, but a crown of gold and sunstones crafted to match his own. "For generations my line has been plagued by a curse of ice. We believed fire magic to be an abomination, a danger to be extinguished. We were wrong. It is not a curse, but a blessing, a gift from the goddess herself, a balance we were too ignorant to understand." He looked directly at Ilara, his love for her open and radiant for all to see. "Ilara is not an omega. She is not an outcast.
She is the fire heart, the dawn that broke my winter. She is my saviour, my love, and my equal. He gently placed the crown upon her head. I present to you, Ilara, my queen. The Queen Mother, Thessaly, stepped forward. Her stern face was softened with a genuine, approving smile. She took Ilara's hands. You saved my son. You saved our line. The kingdom is in your debt. Welcome, my daughter. It was the final seal of approval. The skeptical ally won over completely. The hall erupted in cheers. Ilara looked out at the sea of faces, at the man beside her, his hand now warm and strong in hers. She had started as nothing, an omega meant to be broken. Now she was a queen, crowned not for her bloodline, but for the strength and light she held within. 6 months later, Ilara stood with Kaelin on the high balcony of their chambers, overlooking the sprawling, peaceful kingdom below. Spring had come to the northern lands, and the mountains were dotted with the green of new life. Kaelin wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. His touch was a constant, comforting warmth against her skin. "Happy?" he murmured into her hair. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied, leaning back against his strong chest. He was a different man. The weight of the curse had been replaced by a lightness, a compassion that made him a just and beloved king. He still had his iron will, but it was now tempered by her fire. "I thought my destiny was to freeze," he said quietly, his lips brushing her temple. "A cold end to a cold life." "The goddess just dropped a stitch," she said, smiling. "She needed someone to come along and fix it." He chuckled, a warm, rich sound that still made her heart flutter. He turned her in his arms to face him, his grey eyes full of adoration. "My queen, my salvation." He kissed her, a deep, loving kiss full of promises for the future. He was her king, her partner, her home. She was his warmth, his light, his life. In the heart of the Shadow King, her fire had not just melted the ice, it had kindled a new dawn,